Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 2023 Simplifyance Webinar. Today's webinar is Respecting Client Confidentiality, Privacy, and Security Compliance for Behavioral Healthcare. We're excited today to be joined with Braden Smith, Executive Vice President for Simplifyance. For those of you that are new to Simplifyance, we're a mission-driven team of behavioral healthcare compliance professionals who simplify the complex nature of accreditation and licensing. Our value-based compliance approach includes consulting services and software to simple solutions to the unique challenges in mental health and substance abuse compliance. If you're interested in learning more about our services or would like to have a demo of our software, please visit us at simplifyance.com. Just a few housekeeping. This particular webinar is available to you at no cost. We will be offering an online follow-up evaluation for you to complete. We ask that you please take a moment to complete those evaluations because it provides us with information to learn more about what your needs are and how we can improve. We also will be providing certificates of completion. If you are interested in receiving a certificate, please let us know and we will send one to you electronically. This webinar is being recorded. If you would like access to it later, we invite you to visit our website at simplifyance.com. or you can visit our Simplifyance YouTube channel where we house all of our educational videos. At this time, I'm going to introduce Braden. Braden is the Executive Vice President for Simplifyance. He holds a JD from the University of California, San Francisco, and became interested in privacy and security while in law school. He currently leads a team that works with organizations to respond to state regulations and accreditation standards that are designed to address safety concerns, promote quality care delivery, and improve organizational health. He believes that individuals are best able to access and receive quality care when they trust that their private information will be protected. Additionally, Braden recognizes that behavioral health care is often difficult to access and believes that Simplifyance helps to increase overall access to high quality, safe, and affordable care. With that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Braden.
Thank you so much, Gina. Thank you all for being here today. I'm so excited to be talking about privacy, security, and confidentiality. This is an area of great importance to me, and thank you, Gina, for your introduction. I've done quite a bit of work in privacy and security prior to coming on in this role at Simplifyance, and we'll be talking kind of a little bit about some of the things that I've run into in my previous settings, as well as just overall very good privacy, security, and confidentiality practices. So the objectives that we have here for today is to discuss the importance of privacy, security, and confidentiality in behavioral healthcare settings. We're going to identify some best practices and areas of focus when working with patient and client data. We're going to identify some threats to the privacy, security, and confidentiality of patient data. We're going to review some privacy and security regulations. We're going to demonstrate how to conduct vendor risk management and avoid incidents, and then also understand the required compliance activities after a privacy and security incident occurs. So, what is the importance of privacy, security, and confidentiality in behavioral healthcare? There's a few bullets here. The first one, our clients deserve the right to informational boundaries. And we'll talk a little bit about that. People establish boundaries from others in society, and those boundaries are both physical and informational. People need places of solitude to go to, places where they don't see that they're free to communicate without the gaze of others and to relax and feel at ease. So when we establish these informational boundaries and we, invite other people into learning information about ourselves, and they spill that information and breach that information, it creates very awkward social settings, and it really damages our relationships. And you can see how this would really have a big impact in behavioral healthcare with people that may already have strained relationships with others in their lives and a lack of trust overall with others. And the next bullet point here, trust and communication is necessary for effective care. In all areas of healthcare, effective treatment relies on unhindered communication between patients, clients, and providers. And that's because patients have a unique information about their health that would often cannot or would not be discovered by a provider without being shared by the individual. mental health, and so you can see that, in healthcare generally, it's just very important to have good communications between providers and patients. And behavioral healthcare is especially important. In this third bullet point, we speak to that. Mental health, substance use disorder, and other behavioral health issues are often not quite as easy to spot as physical health issues. For example, it's very easy for a doctor to look at a broken leg and be able to come up with a honest kind of plan of what needs to be happening to correct that. However, with mental health issues, we rely much more on self-reporting. And, additionally, those mental health issues continue to be stigmatized in society. And so that stigma has often already affected the potential client's desire to seek out treatment. And it often prevents people from seeking out treatment at all. So with this increased stigma and with the need to be able to understand through communication the symptoms someone's experiencing with behavioral health issues, this becomes even more important. We really need to have a high level of trust between patients and providers in order to really deliver effective care. And then the last bullet point here is that privacy, security, and confidentiality is required by law. So there's protections for these things in federal law through HIPAA and CFR Part 2, for state laws that were enacted to support these public policy goals. And then even payers are beginning to put requirements into these types of situations around privacy and security. So laws alone will not help patients and clients feel fully comfortable in sharing what they consider to be their most private healthcare information. So I don't see this as the most important point in this, but it's certainly something to keep note of, because having regulators come after you for violating compliance in these areas really is going to cause a lot of strain on your organization. So let's start by talking about some best practices when working with patient and client data. Let's talk first about how confidential data is exposed. So one of the helpful tools in HIPAA is that the privacy and security rules have a lot of examples of the types of breaches that can happen in a healthcare organization and a healthcare setting. So we're going to go kind of and talk a little bit about these HIPAA violations and what they mean and how they play out. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about what a HIPAA violation is. And it's essentially it's a violation of any aspect of the HIPAA standards. But really, it's when there's a breach of HIPAA protected health information, which is known as PHI. So we have that acronym here as well. Some of the most common types of protected health information for patients includes data elements like names, medical record numbers, diagnoses, medications, treatment modalities, social security numbers, dates of birth, addresses, email addresses, phone numbers. Because any combination of two or more HIPAA PHI data elements, those things I just listed now, is enough to trigger a breach. So if you just have a name and a medical record number that goes in an email to the wrong person, that's considered a breach. Because that low threshold exists, even basic confirmation that a client is receiving or has received care with a provider is considered a HIPAA breach. So if you said, Braden Smith was an inpatient resident at XYZ treatment center, that would already be a HIPAA breach, which is a very low standard. So let's look a little bit at a few of the privacy and security breach types that are outlined by HIPAA now and see some of the common examples of how they occur, because these are going to be situations that pop up in your organization all the time. So HIPAA organizes itself into the privacy rule and the security rule. And we're going to start by talking about privacy. So some of the ways that privacy can be breached are through what are called impermissible uses or disclosures. And that may kind of sound like a complicated term, but we're going to break it down now. So the number one thing here is, number one example that we're going to talk about of an impermissible use or disclosure is employees divulging patient information. So we all know patient information needs to be kept private. Employees talking about patients or coworkers to coworkers or friends is a HIPAA violation unless those coworkers have a care, treatment, or service need to know that information. You can see how gossip can be a really big problem. Employees are not allowed to share patient information with friends, family members, or third-party vendors or organizations unless those vendors or organizations have a valid business need to know and have a business associate agreement assigned with the organization that say they're going to protect the privacy the same way that you are. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the future slides, but just wanted to put that up. And employees really need to be discussing patient information when they are discussing it for valid care treatment and services purposes in private places and only with other treatment personnel. There's no reason to share information about confidential information of a client or a patient with anybody else. So that's one example is divulging patient information through talking about it. The next is medical records coming into the wrong hands. And this happens a lot. It's one of the most common HIPAA violations, actually. And it occurs when an organization uses email or some other communication tool and puts client records or charts into those emails and they get sent to the wrong person. If that gets sent to the wrong email, and another person sees that information, whether it's another patient, a vendor, somebody that's in the organization that doesn't have a need to know that, that creates a breach as well. So how do you stop that kind of thing? Well, emails containing patient records and PHI should always be double checked before clicking the send button. And that's something to really hammer home in the trainings that you have with your employees. Inquiries in social settings is another one. You know, it's very common for people to approach clinicians in a social situation and ask about someone that they know as a patient. And, you know, patients could be their friends, family members, and, you know, they have no reason to really know that HIPAA exists. But it doesn't mean, just because someone doesn't know HIPAA exists and they ask about information from a provider, say, for instance, you know, a family member of mine was in a treatment center and I was asking the person that I knew to be their clinician about their care. Unless they have a release of information to disclose that to me, this is a breach as well, even though I'm their family member. And if I had no knowledge of HIPAA, it doesn't really matter because it's the provider that's supposed to be the gatekeeper of that information. We already talked a little bit about sending private information via email. This is something to always double check, and it's often how medical records fall into the wrong hands. That's another example of impermissible use or disclosure. So unauthorized access, and I put snooping on here as well, is another method that a breach can occur as a result of. And this comes when employees are accessing client files and charts without authorization. It's a very common HIPAA violation, and it really doesn't matter the cause. This is one of the most egregious because it's usually intentional. And employees can, the important thing to remember is employees can only access patient information when they've been authorized to do so. And it's actually illegal to do so if it's just purely out of curiosity or to help a friend. So this is clearly one of the most egregious violations of someone's confidentiality, and something that organizations should always be readily monitoring. And snooping is another kind of area of this unauthorized access. And often, you know, this involves employees looking into records that they shouldn't. There are tools that EMR vendors have to help prevent this. System activity review is one area, and then also just overall review of individuals and the charts that they are going into can be another avenue for identifying this bad behavior. Finally, we're going to talk a little bit about minimum necessary violations. And we've touched on this a little bit in some of it, but let's just put a name to it. What minimum necessary really means is providing other staff and employees in the organization with too much information about someone. So for instance, an example would be security personnel in a behavioral health inpatient setting. They would need to know the name and the room number of the clients there so that they can guide them to their room, so that they can ensure that the area is safe, so that they have an outline of who should be where at what times. And that totally is compliant. However, a security person does not need to know any information about the diagnoses of the people that they are in the scenario. So really the minimum necessary standard is to ensure that staff are only told the information that they need in order to perform their job. And they're not told extra information that compromises the privacy and confidentiality of clients. So those are the three kind of privacy related HIPAA violations. We're going to now move to security side. So the security rule really focuses on improper maintenance of physical, administrative, and technical safeguards. So physical safeguards would be something like locking a cabinet that has PHI in it. That would physically prevent someone from being in there. Locking a door that includes computers accessing client records. Technical securities, administrative safeguards would be updating the list of people that receive information about client census to ensure that it's compliant with minimum necessary requirements. It's an administrative function that is a way to ensure that certain people are not receiving information they shouldn't. Technical safeguards are relating to technology. Do you have your computer password protected with a very hard to break password? Are you using multi-factor authentication? Are you ensuring that your emails are encrypted when they're going out to people that may need to access PHI in an email format? Those are the kind of things that you can do on a technical side. So let's talk a little bit about an example of how physical security could be lacking. A stolen item, right? So if an item contains PHI like a laptop, smartphone, tablet, and that's lost or stolen, it's considered a HIPAA violation and can result in a hefty fine, especially if the organization is not able to say that they had the technical safeguards in place to ensure that that was not going to be able to be accessed by someone that shouldn't access it. So, how do you safeguard against this? Any device that contains PHI needs to be password protected. And I think that that's pretty basic at this point. People even do that with their personal devices. So that's a very easy initial step. Also, be sure to lock down any device with PHI when you're using it. So that's as simple as logging off of the computer after you're done accessing records to be sure that, someone else doesn't walk up and start looking at what you were working on. And also, it's pretty obvious, but a password doesn't really do any good if the laptop is left open, and someone else is able to see it. Let's talk a little bit about administrative security. Oftentimes, this comes down to an example of the lack of proper training. So one of the best ways to avoid a HIPAA violation is to make sure that you really train your employees with proper policies and procedures around confidentiality, privacy, and security, all the big things we're talking about today. So we really do need to establish policies that ensure that clients' information is protected and kept confidential at all times. If you feel like your privacy and security policies and procedures could be brushed up, we're a great resource to help you with that. So please reach out to us. We have a lot of experts that work in this, and we'd be happy to help. Again, employees being trained on these policies and procedures is really important as well. So when employees are trained, they're much less likely to make mistakes, but mistakes are going to be made. And when something happens, there needs to be a process and plan to appropriately handle it. So you need to be training not only on the preventative ways of making sure that privacy and confidentiality is protected, but also hold regular meetings to make sure that all of your employees know about the follow-up and plans that they're supposed to do if something does happen. Training all employees on your policy and holding regular meetings to keep it fresh is really, really the big key here. And then lastly, let's talk a little bit about technical security. Technical safeguards, as I mentioned before, generally refer to security aspects of information systems and electronic processes, technological processes. And some of the examples of technical safeguards include different computer security levels are in place for different users. For example, when we talked about the security guards in the previous example of how they have a need to know the room and the names of the clients that are there, they probably don't need on their computers to have access to the EMR. There's information that can be given to them outside of that tool that allow them to be able to effectively do their job. And the same thing goes with levels of security in an EMR. Certain people should be able to see certain things and not see other things. So that's something that you can work with your vendor on as well. Same thing with even, security when it comes to file sharing and file storage. If you're storing PHI in a shared drive, you really want to make sure that only people who are able to look at and view PHI as part of their job duties are able to access that shared drive or that shared folder. So different permissions are really important. Automatic logging off from information systems, computer, tablets, phones after a specified interval. That's a really important one as well. If you have a setting on your laptop that it will go to sleep after 2 minutes of inactivity, it's very low likelihood that when you walk away and 2 minutes goes by, someone's going to be able to log into that computer. And then, user authentication with a logon and passwords. This, again, is the very, very floor of security. And many organizations, I think many of the smart organizations, are enabling two-factor authentication to ensure that user authentication is genuine and that it's actually the right person that's logging in to see the materials. Alrighty, that was a lot of information, and a lot of great best practices, and a lot of great ways to learn about how information can be breached. And there's also these external threats, these common threats to privacy and security that exist as well. And so not only are we having to look through these privacy and security best practices, we also have to look externally to see what other best practices do we need to put in place and what threats do we need to be aware of to ensure that we're effectively protecting the privacy, security, and confidentiality of our clients' information. So some of the common threats to privacy and security of this information are, first of all, phishing. And I think that this has exploded in recent years, and it's been a practice for a long time, but it continues to get more and more difficult to pick out these phishing attempts. So let's define phishing first. Phishing is a practice of infecting an email with malicious links. And often these emails seem very innocuous. They seem like the type of email that you should be getting from the person you're receiving it from. The most common type of phishing is email phishing, but text also has become an increasing way that cyber criminals are using to try to get information and get into your systems. So beware of text as well. But again, email is certainly the place that you should always be the most vigilant. And remember, phishing emails can look really convincing, and they often reference, a well-known medical disturbance. There was a lot of phishing emails related to the COVID-19 pandemic, and trying to get people to click on links out of urgency because there's a medical need. Oftentimes, people will say someone is having a very severe issue, and it blurs people's ability to be critical in their thinking of whether or not to click on links. And that's what these folks are going for. I'll say the most common is a phishing attempt that relates to finance. And this is because the number one goal of cyber criminals is to make money. And so they'll do that however they can. And one of the ways is often, please reroute something to the XYZ bank account, and this needs to be paid today by 5 p.m. That's the type of thing that oftentimes gets people to inadvertently click on something that they really shouldn't be. So be very aware of phishing, and ensure that your team is trained to spot phishing emails and always to forward them to an IT staff member before opening any suspicious links. Credential theft is another big area of threat. So there's always an issue that I just want to mention here. Oftentimes in business, people start sharing credentials. Hey, I really need to get into XYZ system. I don't have the permission. And someone says, here's my username and password. That obviously creates a lot of privacy and security issues. And I just want to encourage everyone to remember to keep your password private and to not conduct this type of activity, because it really opens up a whole new area of risk for you. However, now we have to worry a little bit more about credentials, even than just sharing with other people. That was something that was very much in our control. Now we have something that's still in our control, but a little bit more ephemeral than the previous example. With the numerous large-scale data breaches in recent years, your passwords from old accounts can often be on the dark web for cyber criminals or other people to purchase and try to scam you. And this is a really, really common thing, which is unfortunate, but true. An example of this is the very large breach that happened at LinkedIn. Essentially, I believe it was in 2012, everyone who had a LinkedIn account had their username and password exposed. And cyber criminals still use these lists on the internet to try to hack into other credentials. So how do you prevent this? This seems like a really hard problem. We don't know when someone else is getting breached. I have a Target account. How all of a sudden does that affect my job at a treatment center? The Target got breached, and now how does that affect me here? Well, oftentimes people use the same passwords across different platforms. So for ease sake, I could say, I'm going to use the same password for my personal email, my work email, my Target account, my LinkedIn account, all of these things. And that creates a lot of risk, because the moment one of those credentials sites is breached, you're essentially opening up your password to everything else. All they have to know is that you have a login somewhere else and that you're using the same password everywhere, and they're going to take advantage of that. So we need to ensure our employees receive training on how to create brand new and complex passwords. And also, again, another plug for two-factor authentication. That can certainly help with this as well, because even if you have the correct password, if you don't have that second factor of authentication, that person's not going to be able to get in. So that's a huge way to prevent this as well. So as cyber criminals get more sophisticated, hacking and ransomware are also becoming really much more challenging to combat. And this is where having good IT personnel is really important, or using IT professional services to make sure that your computers, your other electronic devices, your way that you're sending email, the way that you're communicating is secure. And that's a big way to prevent those things. So we talked a little bit about the threats there. Now let's talk a little bit legal speaking of the regulations that are around privacy and security. So we mentioned under federal law, HIPAA protects individuals' protected health information. And any breach of those needs to be reported to the Department of Health and Human Services. And the Department of Health and Human Services has an office inside of it called the Office of Civil Rights, whose sole job is to investigate breaches and bring enforcement actions against non-compliant organizations. And if you think about that, those are people that you really don't want to be working with on a daily basis, because all they're doing is combing through all of your compliance stuff and continually talking to you about all the things you're not doing correctly and making suggestions that cost a lot of money. So these are the folks that really don't want to be in a situation where you have to be working with them. And the way that you can avoid that is really ensuring that you have great privacy, security, and confidentiality practices at your organization. So as I mentioned, the Office of Civil Rights investigates breaches and brings these enforcement actions. And we're going to see some examples of these in the following slides, because it certainly will hammer home how difficult it is to go through this for an organization. Additionally, some states have laws protecting confidentiality as well. For example, in Colorado, a confidentiality breach is considered a critical incident and needs to be reported to the Behavioral Health Administration, which is formerly the Office of Behavioral Health. So again, this is another way that a regulator can start affecting your daily operations because you weren't able to follow the right practices around confidentiality. They will certainly be doing an investigation of any critical incidents, and due to the fact that a confidentiality breach is a critical incident, that means that that's what they're going to be investigating. And then at this point, even payers can be considered regulators in this area, and not from a legal perspective of, oh, the government is coming in, but from a legal perspective of, oh, we've contracted with some of these payers that are requiring additional privacy and security measures from us that are beyond legal requirements. But contractually, we need to meet those requirements. Otherwise, it's a breach of contract. And those payers can say, we're going to take our insurance dollars elsewhere, or we're going to claw back some of the money that you already paid out to you due to the fact that your privacy and security was not to the point that we needed it to be, and you weren't following the contractual basis. So that's a very important thing to keep in mind and to look for when you're entering into relationships with payers. What are the standards that they have, and are you complying with them? Because if not, that could be a significant clawback, and that could be significant financial penalties for the organization. All righty, so let's talk a little bit about some of these HIPAA breaches that resulted in some serious issues for companies. We'll talk first about Banner Health. Banner Health is one of the largest nonprofit healthcare organizations in the country. It operates mainly out of Arizona, but it has locations in California, Colorado, Nevada, Wyoming, Nebraska, and they provide a very wide range of both physical and behavioral health services. So this is a very, very large organization. And we will see that in HIPAA, the larger an organization is, and the more means that an organization has, the regulators understand that those larger organizations are bigger targets for cyber criminals and bigger targets for breaches, and have a higher standard due to the fact that they have more employees and more things going on with protected health information than, for instance, some smaller providers. That's not to say smaller providers can just get away with saying, we're very small and we don't have the resources to put effective policies and procedures or something like that in place. But what it does mean is, as you continue to grow, the level of scrutiny from the Department of Health and Human Services and the Office of Civil Rights goes up. And so just something to be mindful as you grow your organization about is this becomes more and more serious as you grow. So what did Banner do? They failed to comply with the HIPAA security rule, which protects electronic protected health information from cybersecurity attacks. And, they obviously had a very big target on their back. They're in many different states. They have a lot of different members, and they're providing a lot of different services. But what did they failed to analyze any of the risks and vulnerabilities to the electronic protected health information that they had across their organization. So they weren't proactive in their approach to privacy, security, and confidentiality. And they didn't monitor the health information systems activity. We talked a little bit about this as well. There was a lot of information going everywhere, and no one was really paying attention to who had access to what information. They didn't have an authentication process for those that are accessing electronic PHI. This is pretty egregious considering how we talked about how passwords are pretty basic at this point. So, obviously a big thing there for them. And they didn't have any security measures in place to protect ePHI from unauthorized access. Meaning, someone is able to access records that they probably shouldn't be, and there was no measure in place to ensure that someone couldn't do that. So how did this result? They had a $1.25 million settlement that they had to pay to the Office of Behavioral Health. And they had to implement a corrective action plan. And the Office of Behavioral Health, the Office of Civil Rights stayed on them. So part of their corrective action plan is the Office of Civil Rights is going to come out and do audits for 3 years after this. Can you imagine not only having to pay this large settlement, but also having essentially regulators now invited into your organization whenever they'd like over the next 3 years, and you having to be at their mercy of all the things that you have to answer for them? It's certainly a huge lift for organizations. And this organization being large enough could in some ways absorb that blow, but it certainly was not going to be a happy day for any of the leadership there when they found out about this enforcement action and its final verdict. All righty. Let's talk a little bit more about another organization that found itself in trouble. Lifespan Corporation is a nonprofit health system that's based in Rhode Island, and it provides, again, a nice wide range of both physical and behavioral health services. They failed to comply with the HIPAA security rule. They did not encrypt the ePHI in a hospital employee's laptop, which was stolen. As a result, that laptop had over 20,000 individuals' names, medical record numbers, demographic information, the data elements that we talked about that are important in HIPAA, and medication information. So, all these data elements were contained in this employee's laptop that was not encrypted. Someone was going to be able to access that after it gotten stolen. And so as a result, they had over $1 million settlement and also had to implement a corrective action plan. These are things that your organization doesn't want to have to do. Having your regulators in your organization all the time is not conducive to good business, and it is really going to drain your employees' time. All righty. So now that we've kind of talked a little bit about the scary regulatory things that can happen, let's talk a little bit about other risk areas. We wanted to talk about the topic of vendors and how they affect risk. So sharing PHI with vendors, it's always creating a risk. And that's something that's just kind of basic that we need to know, is once protected health information leaves your organization and goes to another, there's automatically risk there. Now, how do we mitigate that risk? How do we ensure that, these vendors are going to actually protect the information well? Well, all vendors that handle PHI need to sign a business associate agreement, or BAA, with the providers that they are handling PHI for. If you do not have BAAs in place with organizations that are able to view and access or receive PHI or do some sort of business process that handles PHI for you, that's something that you need to get in place immediately. The good news is that agreement basically says that the vendor is going to handle the PHI at the same standards as HIPAA and at the same standards as the provider sharing the information. So not only are they signing up to agree that they will follow the HIPAA standards, they also agree that whatever your security posture is, they're going to be at least that good. It's a great thing. It's a great thing to have in place, and it's a great way of keeping vendors accountable. And the really nice thing is, rather than having to go pay a lawyer to try to find this agreement and put one in place, the Department of Health and Human Services has provided a free business associate agreement template on their website to providers. And if you'd like to reach out to Simplifyance to get that link, you can. If you just want to Google it, I'm sure you could find it that way too. But this is a great resource that's free that the Department of Health and Human Services is giving all providers. So beyond the business associate agreement, how do you establish a vendor risk management program that can better help you understand where your risk is the highest? Because mitigating the highest level of risk is always a great and important task. A successful vendor risk management, or VRM, program looks at what PHI data elements are shared with a vendor. So typically the way this is successful is vendors are evaluated one at a time, and they go through these types of questions. What PHI data elements are being shared with a vendor? If it's, billing information, name, social security number, wow, that's a lot of financial risk. If it's diagnosis, medications, that's a huge risk towards, the side of people's personal feelings of trust. I don't want my medications getting out there. I don't want people to know my diagnoses and things like that. So first analyzing what PHI data elements are shared with a vendor, and looking at it in the way of the more data elements that we're sharing and the more sensitive data that we are sharing, the higher the protection the vendor needs to have. Second, what methods are we sharing PHI with the vendor? Is it through email? Is it a secure server connection? Is it physical PHI? Is it actually paper or medication bottles or things like that? And there's different risk associated with the different methods of sharing PHI. Then what is the vendor's purpose for handling the information? Oftentimes, the first question to ask here is, does the vendor even need to have PHI access to perform their function? And then secondly, if they need to have access to it, could they perform their function just as successfully with fewer data elements or less PHI as part of their access? Lastly, evaluating the vendor's level of IT security and staff training is important. So asking proactively in conversations about vendors, what type of IT security do you have? What is your training program for people that are accessing or handling PHI? These things are really, really great things to ask. We talked a little bit about how to try to proactively prevent privacy incidents. We talked about how to even prevent them on the vendor type level. But we need to understand that even with the best practices in place, privacy and security events are going to happen. And organizations are expected to know how to handle them too. You're not just expected to be proactive in your approach to this, you're also expected to be reactive in the right ways when issues happen. So organizations need to establish an incident management reporting process to do this. And privacy and security incidents is one area that will be reported through that process. If your organization doesn't have a process for reporting incidents, you really need to establish one. And our Simplifyance software tool includes an incident management reporting and follow-up tool that's really exemplary. So please feel free to contact us about that. But I want to also just talk about, once the incident gets reported, what are the ways that we actually work through the incident management process? And in my experience working with privacy and security incidents and other types of incidents throughout my career, there's 4 main areas of focus when you're working on an incident. The first area, and these don't always go in chronological order, I'll just mention that, but we're going to talk about them kind of as first, second, third, fourth for means of this presentation. But the first area is investigation. And this is actually usually the first area that you go to. Investigation is all about what happened. What was the root cause of the issue? What policies, procedures, and processes were not followed properly? Or what policies, procedures, and processes were not in place? Next is mitigation. How do we stop the bleeding is oftentimes the way that people talk about mitigation. What actions do we need to stop the exposure of PHI? What actions do we need to limit and reduce the situation that's happening right now? If we had someone putting on a public web page a lot of PHI and that remains up, we haven't mitigated that issue yet. We need to go find a way to get that web page taken down. And there's definitely ways to be able to do that. Next is corrective action. So what actions need to be put in place to prevent future exposure of PHI in this way? If we don't have policies and procedures in place, we probably need to put them in place and train people up on them. If a new type of situation happened that we don't have a policy around, let's create a new policy. And if somebody already has signed off on a policy and agreed to follow it and they're not doing that, how do we put corrective action in place for that employee to ensure that they're trained, or in some cases of egregious breaches, that they no longer are at the organization? Lastly is the notification requirement. So not only do you have to notify regulators, we talked about notifying in, like the state of Colorado being an example of a state regulator, but HHS and OCR is one that you'll always have to notify when there's a breach that occurred. Sometimes you have to notify payers if there's a contractual requirement to notify them. And HIPAA says that you have to notify your clients and patients by first-class mail as soon as possible, but no later than 60 days after the discovery of a breach. So a lot of notification efforts need to be put in place, and there's specific ways that people have to be notified. That creates a lot of exposure for the organization about what happened. It gets out into the public sphere. And, that's its own kind of area where organizations have to really think through, how do we do this in the most legally compliant and best possible way for us? All right. So thank you so much to everyone. I really enjoyed giving this presentation. I know that there was a lot of content today, but we do have about 15 minutes, and I'd like to open up for questions from the group.
Thank you, Braden. One question that I had specifically focused on what type of privacy recommendations do you have for people who, or is there policies around engaging with clients post-treatment as alumni?
Yeah, that's definitely a big area that we see a lot of organizations needing our help with, is developing those types of policies. There are very appropriate alumni engagement type of experiences that can be had. There's also very inappropriate ways to engage alumni and previous clients. The best way that I have to say is I really think that it depends on the individual experience, and organizations really should probably reach out to us, because developing these policies is going to be unique to your organization, and it's going to take a little bit of time and effort to ensure that the outreach to alumni is one that's appropriate, and that the wrong people aren't out doing outreach. Usually what that involves, Gina, to more specifically answer your question, is designating the people that are able to do engagement with alumni and letting everyone else know that that is not your responsibility and you're expected not to make that engagement. Then training the people that are on that engagement list on how to effectively work with alumni so you're not crossing any boundaries.
Thank you. I know that there's a lot of concern in some organizations when they engage with alumni through social media, and the fact that social media has become a prolific way for alumni to communicate with staff. Is there anything specific that you can talk to in regards to, and I think you mentioned this already, which alumni or which staff can have access to social media to engage with clients post-treatment?
Yeah, so it really needs to be, again, alumni engagement type of folks that are tasked with that. And I think a really good way of ensuring that you don't have issues with social media is telling all employees that you're not able to use social media to connect with alumni. You're not able to use social media for any part of your job function unless that's specifically outlined in your job function. So you're not a representative of the treatment center. You're not a representative of your organization on social media, and you're not supposed to be contacting people that have gone through your organization. That's a way to be as safe as possible. And that's a very difficult thing to monitor, but it's certainly an area of risk for organizations. Social media is an area where anybody can connect, but it's also an area where there's a lot of fertile ground for privacy, confidentiality, and security breaches. Mainly privacy and confidentiality is, you start chatting with somebody on a public forum on social media that was in your organization, and then they say, oh yeah, blah, 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 XYZ happened. And then you respond, oh yeah, when you were here, you mentioned this. Well, all of a sudden that's a privacy breach. You put that onto a public forum, and that person never gave you the permission to say, yeah, I was at your treatment center, and yeah, I said that thing. So there's a lot of risk with social media, and my recommendation is to be very, very careful about the people that you allow to post on social media and to connect with folks, just to ensure that you're not having any issues with that.
Thank you. So it doesn't look like we have any additional questions at this time. If you wanted to go to the last slide, I believe
Yes.
we have some just contact information for individuals who are interested in learning more about Simplifyance. You can visit us at simplifyance.com. We'd be happy to answer questions and offer any kind of support that you might need around compliance management, and provide you with access to an innovative software platform that we use within organizations to help with compliance management. So with that, I want to thank you, Braden, again for this important and very necessary webinar on privacy and security. And we hope that all of you enjoyed it. Please join us for our next webinar coming up in April. We'll be sending out some information, and you can certainly check our website to learn more about our upcoming topics for discussion around accreditation and licensing. Thank you, Braden.
Thank you so much, Gina.